Welcome back to Swift Tale, where we tell powerful stories that tug at your heartstrings and make you think. If you're visiting for the first time, hit that like button, share the video with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible tales like the one we're about to dive into. Now, let me ask you, what would you do if you saw a beloved pet abandoned in the street just because its owner passed away? It's hard to even imagine, right? Well, today, you're going to hear a story that starts with heartbreak and betrayal, but ends with an unexpected twist that will restore your faith in humanity. This is the story of a millionaire, a loyal German shepherd named Ranger, and an unlikely hero, a Navy SEAL. It begins with a wife's funeral. After her death, the millionaire, grief-stricken but cold-hearted, decides that the dog she loved so much is nothing more than a nuisance. He kicks Ranger out, telling him to find another home. And just like that, the faithful German shepherd is left to fend for himself on the streets. But what happens next is nothing short of remarkable. A Navy SEAL, recently back from active duty, crosses paths with Ranger. The bond they form not only saves the dog, but leads to a fight for what is right. Why does this story matter? It's about much more than just a dog. It's about loyalty, love, and the lengths one man goes to protect something he believes in. It raises the question, how far should someone go for another being, even if that being is a dog? And what does it say about us as people when someone who has nothing to gain, other than the simple act of kindness, steps in to correct a wrong? Today, we'll explore how compassion can sometimes come from the most unexpected places and how the most unlikely hero can change everything. So sit tight, because what happens next will surprise you. Before everything changed, the millionaire lived a life many could only dream of. He was a self-made man, his wealth built from years of hard work and sharp decisions in the cutthroat world of finance. Born into modest means, he had climbed the ranks of the corporate world, becoming a titan in his field. His mansion, perched high on a hill overlooking the city, was a symbol of his success. It had everything: luxurious furnishings, sprawling gardens, and every gadget or convenience one could imagine. Yet, despite all his accomplishments, the millionaire never seemed truly satisfied. His life was filled with material wealth, but lacked the one thing that had once been important to him: meaningful connection. His wife, Margaret, was a stark contrast to him. Where he was guarded, she was open. Where he was focused on business, she was focused on people. Margaret had a quiet kindness about her, always putting others first. But perhaps her greatest love was her dog, Ranger, a majestic German shepherd with a loyalty that seemed unmatched. Margaret had adopted Ranger as a pup when she and the millionaire were still young and just starting their life together. The dog had been a constant companion throughout the years, growing alongside their marriage. Where the millionaire was emotionally distant, Margaret's bond with Ranger was unbreakable. In the early days of their marriage, the millionaire had appreciated the dog's presence. It was a symbol of their growing family, a living creature to care for. But over the years, as his success grew, so did his obsession with control and perfection. The wealth and status he'd worked so hard to achieve became his world, leaving Margaret, and by extension, Ranger, relegated to the sidelines. He couldn't understand why his wife would pour so much affection into a dog when she should be doting on him. Over time, he began to resent how much of her attention and love went toward Ranger. While he spent his days immersed in meetings, conferences, and work trips, Margaret would spend hers at home, playing with the dog in the gardens, walking him through the neighborhood, and taking long drives with him to the countryside. This shift in dynamics created an invisible wall between husband and wife. The millionaire had always been a man of logic and reason, driven by numbers and goals, but he couldn't understand Margaret's emotional attachment to Ranger. He saw it as a weakness, something that took away from the relationship they once shared. His resentment toward the dog quietly simmered, even though he never spoke of it aloud. The millionaire never had a strong bond with Ranger himself. The dog wasn't a part of his world. He was merely a fixture of his wife. As Margaret's health began to decline, this divide between them only deepened. The millionaire's frustration grew. He couldn't understand why his wife was so attached to the dog in the face of such a life-threatening illness. He saw Ranger as an obstacle, something that drew attention away from what he believed should have been the focus: getting Margaret well. But no amount of medical treatment or money could save her. She passed away quietly, surrounded by her family, and leaving behind a legacy of love, compassion, and, unfortunately, a dog whose fate was now in the hands of a grieving, bitter husband. Her death marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the millionaire, but for Ranger as well. The millionaire, despite the emotional toll of losing his wife, began to see only one thing clearly: he no longer wanted Ranger in his life. To him, the dog represented a part of his wife that he couldn't get back, a constant reminder of the emotional connection he'd never had. It was in this grief-stricken moment, filled with cold logic and anger, that he made the fateful decision to cast Ranger aside, leaving the loyal dog to fend for himself on the unforgiving streets. The millionaire's inability to understand love, especially the unconditional, unwavering love that Margaret had for her dog, was the catalyst for what would become an extraordinary series of events, all set in motion by one simple, heartless act: kicking Ranger out. Margaret's illness was insidious, creeping up on her in a way that no one could have expected. At first, it was just the occasional fatigue, a few missed days of work, and some unexplained aches. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Doctors delivered the diagnosis: cancer, stage 4. It was too late for treatment to be effective, and Margaret's world, once full of light and hope, began to dim. For the millionaire, the news was a jarring blow. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But where most people would feel a deep sense of empathy and compassion in the face of such a loss, the millionaire's reaction was more complex. He had spent so many years focused on success, wealth, and status that he was ill-prepared for the emotional devastation of a terminal illness. The time he had once spent working in boardrooms and making deals was now spent in sterile hospitals, where nothing could fix the deepening fracture between him and his wife. Through it all, Ranger was by Margaret's side. As her health deteriorated, the dog seemed to sense it even before she did. His behavior changed, becoming more protective, more gentle. The German shepherd, who had always been known for his intelligence and loyalty, seemed to take on the role of guardian, sensing her needs long before anyone else did. Whether Margaret needed someone to lean on while getting out of bed or a comforting presence during a difficult night, Ranger was there, lying next to her on the floor, his warm body a constant source of solace. He would nudge her hand when she reached for her tea, stare intently at her when she looked sad, and even bark softly when she was struggling to breathe, as if urging her to stay strong. Ranger's devotion was palpable. Margaret would often sit by the window with him, gazing out at the gardens, reminiscing about their life together, and telling him stories about the good old days. She would stroke his fur, her fingers tender, as if in gratitude for his unwavering presence. It was during these moments that the bond between them deepened, transcending the ordinary relationship between a woman and her dog. Margaret saw Ranger not just as a pet, but as a companion who had shared in her joys, her sorrows, and now her pain. He was her emotional anchor, her constant in a world that was quickly falling apart. In contrast, the millionaire's reaction to his wife's illness was one of increasing frustration and detachment. He found it hard to connect with Margaret during her final months, and his emotions were often clouded by the pressure of keeping up appearances. He was used to fixing problems, to making things better, but this was one problem he couldn't solve. The disease was relentless, and there was no cure to be found in his vast wealth or connections. He became irritable and distant, retreating further into himself. It wasn't that he didn't care for Margaret. He did, in his own way, but his emotional response was rooted in control. He couldn't control her illness, and he couldn't control the grief that came with it. Worse still, he found himself growing resentful of the bond between Margaret and Ranger. He couldn't understand why she clung so tightly to the dog in her final days. To him, it felt like an unnecessary attachment, a distraction from what should have been their last moments together. As Margaret's strength waned, her relationship with Ranger became even more pronounced. The millionaire, who had always prided himself on being logical and pragmatic, couldn't understand why his wife would choose to spend her last months comforting a dog instead of focusing on him. In his mind, he was the one who should have been the center of her world. He began to view Ranger not as a faithful companion, but as a symbol of everything that was wrong with their marriage, something that stood between him and the emotional connection he desperately craved but couldn't seem to access. In those final months, the millionaire became less and less involved. He would leave the house for long stretches, spending his time at the office or on golf courses, as if trying to escape the suffocating reality at home. When he did return, he often found his wife in the garden or on the couch, her head resting on Ranger, the dog's watchful eyes never leaving her. The millionaire never fully understood why Margaret clung so tightly to the dog, but as her health declined, he began to resent it more and more. The bond between them, once strained but stable, became irreparably damaged as the wife's dependence on Ranger grew. And in the midst of his frustration, he started to distance himself emotionally, not just from Margaret, but from Ranger as well. The final weeks of Margaret's life were an emotional tug-of-war. While Margaret found comfort in Ranger's presence, the millionaire became a silent observer, his own heart tangled in confusion, anger, and regret. He could never express what he felt, but in the depths of his cold detachment, he started to see Ranger not as a loyal companion, but as an intruder. It was a quiet, destructive shift, one that would ultimately lead to the fateful decision that would change everything. The day of Margaret's funeral was cold and grey, the kind of weather that matched the somber mood of everyone in attendance. The mansion, usually a place of grand events and opulence, now stood silent and still, its walls filled only with the echoes of grief. The millionaire, dressed in black, stood at the head of the casket, his face stoic, his eyes red from hours of quiet mourning. Around him, friends and family whispered in hushed tones, their faces filled with sympathy. Yet despite the outpouring of condolences, he remained distant, detached from the scene. To the outside world, he appeared composed, an embodiment of strength and control. But on the inside, the billionaire's emotions churned, a mixture of sorrow, frustration, and deep, unresolved anger. Anger not just at the illness that had stolen his wife from him, but at the fact that he could never quite understand her need to find comfort in Ranger rather than in him. Margaret's funeral was the culmination of months of pain and decline. It was a public moment, a final goodbye, and yet for the millionaire it felt like a private torment. As he stood beside the gravesite, a crowd of mourners gathered in the distance, their faces etched with sadness. Ranger, however, was close by, sitting quietly next to Margaret's casket, his head low and his tail tucked. The dog had been there every step of the way, never leaving Margaret's side even in her final days. He had followed the hearse to the cemetery, as he always had during their trips, an ever-loyal companion, watching over the woman he loved like no other could. Ranger's presence at the gravesite was both comforting and heart-wrenching. His loyalty, unwavering and pure, was evident to everyone who saw him. Yet, for the millionaire, it was a cruel reminder of the emotional divide that had existed between him and his wife. Margaret had always seen in Ranger the kind of love and affection that she had longed to receive from her husband. The dog had been her constant companion, her emotional support, while the millionaire had remained a distant figure, physically present but emotionally absent. As he looked at Ranger, the millionaire's anger began to boil over. The dog in his mind had come to represent everything he couldn't fix, the growing chasm between him and Margaret, the love he hadn't been able to offer, the moments he had failed to cherish. He resented the dog for being everything he wasn't, loyal, loving, and attentive. In his grief, the millionaire couldn't separate his pain from his bitterness, and in that moment, he made the decision that would set the stage for the story to come. As the service ended and the last few people began to file away, the millionaire took one final look at the grave. He could feel his chest tightening, his heart heavy with unresolved guilt and regret. But then his gaze shifted toward Ranger, still sitting quietly beside the grave, his eyes locked on the headstone as if waiting for some final sign of approval. It was then that the millionaire's resentment flared. The dog didn't need to be there. He was just a reminder of the distance between them. The wife he had lost and the love he could never seem to give. In the millionaire's mind, Ranger was now just a burden, a painful reminder of his failure. Without a word, without any sign of emotion other than a brief flash of irritation, the millionaire turned and walked away. He entered the mansion, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. For a moment, he considered the possibility of keeping Ranger, perhaps for the sake of preserving some semblance of the life they once had, or maybe out of guilt. But that thought was fleeting. When he passed the front door, he glanced out at the front yard, where Ranger had been packing. The dog stood near the gates, looking up the road as if waiting for something, perhaps Margaret to return or for the pain to end. It was then, in that moment of cold detachment, that the millionaire made up his mind. He went to the garage and retrieved a leash, attaching it to Ranger's collar with a firm tug. The dog, sensing his master's discomfort, didn't bark or resist. He simply followed, obedient and trusting as he always had. They walked out of the mansion together, past the well-manicured gardens, the grand driveway, and the fountain that had once symbolized their prosperity. Ranger's paws clicked against the stone pathway, his movements slow but purposeful. He didn't understand what was happening, but he trusted his owner. When they reached the gates of the estate, the millionaire paused, his hand gripping the collar tighter. For a brief moment he hesitated, but that hesitation passed quickly, replaced by a cold determination. He opened the gates, looked down at Ranger, and with a sharp command told the dog to leave. "Find somewhere else to go," the millionaire said, his voice empty of emotion. "You're not wanted here anymore." Ranger, bewildered and confused, stood still, looking up at his owner with eyes that seemed to plead for a sign of compassion. But the millionaire simply turned his back and walked away, closing the gates behind him with a final, deafening thud. Ranger stood there for a moment longer, staring at the closed gates, unsure of what to do. His entire world had just been ripped away. His beloved owner, the man who had once been his companion, now considered him nothing more than a nuisance. The German shepherd didn't know where to go or what to do. All he knew was that Margaret was gone, and now so was his home. What followed was a quiet and heartbreaking journey. A loyal dog, once adored and cherished, now left alone in the world with no one to protect him. But this was only the beginning of the story, because sometimes, when things seem their darkest, an unexpected hero steps in. But Ranger's path would not be a lonely one for long. Ranger stood at the gates of the mansion, his tail slightly tucked between his legs, eyes wide with confusion and a touch of disbelief. He had been dismissed, discarded by the only person he had ever known as a master. The gates slammed shut behind him, and for the first time in his life, Ranger found himself alone, completely, utterly alone. The world outside the mansion's walls was foreign to him, a vast, unwelcoming place he had never seen from the comfort of his cushioned bed by the fireplace or the manicured lawns he had once roamed freely. For a long moment, Ranger didn't move. He simply stared at the closed gates, waiting for something to change, for the millionaire to come out and call him back inside. But the minutes turned to hours and no one came. Slowly, the reality began to sink in. Margaret was gone, and now so was his home. Ranger's paws, once accustomed to the soft carpets of the mansion, now scraped against the harsh pavement as he began walking aimlessly down the road. He had no destination in mind, only the instinct to put one foot in front of the other, as he had done countless times before. He was a creature of habit, but these were habits forged in a life of security and comfort, habits that no longer made sense in this cold, unfeeling world outside the gates. As the day faded into evening, Ranger's hunger became apparent. He sniffed around trash cans and scoured the streets for scraps, his once glossy coat now matted and dirty from the dust and grime of the unfamiliar environment. He was used to being fed at precise times, to having bowls of fresh water and a comfortable place to sleep, but now everything had changed. The night was cold, the streetlights flickering overhead, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Ranger found a small corner by an alley and huddled there, his body curled tight, trying to conserve warmth. His mind was still reeling from the events of the day, the final look of rejection from the man he had once called master, the coldness in his voice when he was told to leave. But even in the midst of his confusion and despair, something deep within Ranger's nature kicked in. He didn't give up. He couldn't. Even without Margaret by his side, the dog's loyalty to her and to his own instincts kept him going. He had survived the first night, and he would survive the next. But survival was a different game on the streets. It was a world filled with uncertainty, danger, and indifference. Ranger had always been a dog of quiet dignity, strong in his silence and unwavering in his loyalty. But on the streets, he was just another stray, forgotten by the world around him. The next few days were an endless cycle of searching for food, finding shelter, and dodging the cruelty of the city's harshest elements. Ranger was no longer the proud, confident dog who had once protected Margaret in her final days. He was now just another animal trying to survive, fighting against hunger, loneliness, and the fear of being completely forgotten. He wandered through the streets, scavenging whatever scraps he could find. Sometimes kind-hearted strangers would offer him food or give him a pat on the head, but those moments were fleeting. The rest of the time, he was just another nameless dog, left to fend for himself in the vast, indifferent world outside the mansion's gates. It wasn't long before Ranger encountered the first real threat to his survival. A pack of stray dogs, wild-eyed and desperate, approached him one afternoon as he rummaged through a garbage can near a busy intersection. They circled him, growling low, their teeth bared. Ranger. His instincts still sharp despite the circumstances, stood his ground. He knew how to defend himself, but the odds were against him. There were too many of them, and he was weakened by days of hunger and stress. The pack advanced, and for a moment, Ranger feared he would be overwhelmed. But just as the first dog lunged, a loud shout broke through the chaos. "Hey, get off him!" A man tall, rugged, and wearing a military-style jacket rushed forward, pushing the stray dogs back with a commanding voice. Ranger froze, his ears pricking up at the unfamiliar tone. The man kicked at the pack, driving them away, and for the first time in days, Ranger felt a flicker of hope. The stranger knelt down in front of him, looking him over with a concerned expression. "You all right, buddy?" the man asked, his voice gentle but firm. Ranger hesitated, his body still tense from the confrontation, but there was something about this man that felt different. He wasn't like the people who had ignored him or shooed him away in the past few days. This man saw him, really saw him. Slowly, Ranger stepped forward, his head lowered, his body still unsure, but something in the man's presence was reassuring. The man didn't flinch or back away. Instead, he extended his hand slowly, offering it for Ranger to sniff. It was a tentative moment, but it marked the beginning of a bond that would change everything for Ranger. The man was a stranger, but there was an understanding between them. Ranger nudged the man's hand, his body language signaling that he was no longer a threat. The man smiled, crouching down to pat the dog's head. "Looks like you've had a rough time of it," the man muttered, more to himself than to Ranger. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." The man didn't ask questions. He didn't push Ranger away or demand anything from him. He simply offered the dog the one thing that had been missing in the last few days: kindness. Ranger, exhausted but grateful, followed the man without hesitation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Someone had noticed him, someone had cared. Jake Carter had spent most of his life in service to his country. A former Navy SEAL, he had seen things that most people would never imagine, let alone experience firsthand. He had been to war zones, faced impossible odds, and lived through moments where survival seemed like a distant hope. But after leaving active duty, he had returned to civilian life, and it wasn't long before he realized that his new mission was far more difficult than anything he'd faced overseas. The transition was harder than he'd expected, the constant feeling of being lost, adrift in a world that moved too fast for him, was almost unbearable. For a man who had spent years trained to operate under the most intense pressure, Jake found himself struggling with the quiet of everyday life. He rented a small apartment in the city, a few miles from the coastline, where the weight of the world felt heavier than it ever had before. Without the adrenaline of combat to fuel him, the days began to blur together, and the nights were worse. The silence, the lack of structure, the sense of purpose that he once had in the military, everything felt like it had been ripped away. He spent his time in the gym, trying to exhaust his mind and body in a way that might bring him peace, but it never lasted long. His mind wandered back to the days when he had a cause to fight for, a team to depend on, and a purpose that guided his every action. But now, that sense of purpose was gone, replaced with a quiet desperation. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jake found himself walking through the city's downtown area, trying to clear his head. He hadn't planned on being there, but a routine walk was the only thing that seemed to help. The air was cool, the streets bustling with people going about their day. Jake moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the familiar faces, but it wasn't the people who caught his attention, it was the dog. Jake first saw him near a busy intersection, the German shepherd standing alone beside a garbage can, his head low, his fur matted and dirty. The dog's eyes, however, were what caught Jake's attention. There was an unmistakable look of desperation in them, a look that reminded him of the soldiers he had seen in the field, those who had lost everything and were still struggling to hold on. But this dog wasn't just looking for food or a place to rest. There was something deeper in his gaze. The way the dog held himself, his body tense, yet somehow resigned, told Jake that this was a dog who had seen hardship. And as much as Jake tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was in trouble. He was drawn to the animal, and without thinking, Jake crossed the street. As he approached, the dog looked up at him with wary eyes, as if sizing him up, unsure of whether to trust this new figure who had appeared in his world. Jake slowed his pace, trying not to startle him. His hand instinctively went to the pocket of his jacket, where he kept a small protein bar, a habit from his days in the military, always prepared for the unexpected. He crouched down, offering the bar to the dog, his voice soft but firm. "Hey there, boy, you hungry?" The dog took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air, but didn't take the food immediately. There was a flicker of caution in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure whether this man was a threat or someone who could help. Jake didn't push, didn't move any closer. He just waited patiently, understanding that trust wasn't something you could rush, especially with a creature who had probably been abandoned, left to fend for himself in a world that didn't care. It wasn't until the dog's stomach gave an audible growl that he finally took a step closer. Jake held the protein bar out once more, and this time, the dog took it gently from his hand, his eyes still filled with wariness but also a flicker of hope. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt like something significant. Jake knew better than to make sudden moves, so he simply stood up, backing away slightly to give the dog space to eat in peace. He let the dog finish the snack, watching as the once-proud German shepherd devoured the food with a desperate hunger that told Jake everything he needed to know. This dog hadn't just been abandoned, he had been forgotten, left alone, cast out into a world where he didn't belong. Jake had seen that look before, the same look in the eyes of soldiers who came back from war, who had been left behind by the very system they fought to protect. He had no idea why the dog was out here, but he could tell that he wasn't just another stray. There was something different about him, something that resonated with Jake's own sense of abandonment. Maybe it was the fact that the dog reminded him of the men and women he had served with, the loyalty, the resilience, the quiet strength that came from years of being in the trenches. After a few moments, Jake decided to take action. He couldn't leave the dog here, not like this. There was something about him, something in the way he looked at Jake that stirred an old instinct in him. Jake had always been the one to protect, to help others, and now, for the first time since returning home, he felt like he had a purpose again. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone, quickly dialing the number of a local animal shelter that he knew would be able to help the dog. "Hey, I've got a situation. There's a German shepherd here, looks like he's been living on the streets. He needs help." The shelter assured him that they could send someone right away, but Jake knew the dog couldn't wait for that long. He couldn't leave him out here alone. He needed to make sure the dog would be safe. So, with a gentle but firm command, he motioned for the dog to follow him. "Come on, boy," Jake said softly, his voice calm but determined. "Let's get you out of here." The dog, after a long moment of hesitation, stood up and trotted after Jake. There was still some wariness in his movements, but a sense of trust was starting to form. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ranger wasn't alone. And for Jake, the first step toward finding peace had just begun. Jake led Ranger to his small apartment, his footsteps purposeful but slow, allowing the dog to adjust to the unfamiliar environment. At first, Ranger hesitated, sniffing at every corner of the hallway and looking back at the street as if he expected something or someone to come chasing after him. But there was no one. The world outside had already moved on, and now, for the first time in days, Ranger was safe. The apartment was modest, but it was clean and quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the streets. Jake had no intention of keeping Ranger here long-term. He wasn't ready for a pet, and he knew the dog needed professional care. But at this moment, all that mattered was that the dog had a place to rest. Inside, Jake set up a small area for Ranger near the couch, laying down an old blanket he hadn't used in years. He didn't have a dog bed, but he had enough of a soft surface to offer the German shepherd some comfort. He stood back for a moment, watching as Ranger cautiously padded over to the blanket and laid down with a sigh, his body exhausted from days of wandering the streets. It wasn't much, but it was the first real rest the dog had had in days, maybe even longer. Jake moved to the kitchen, pulling out whatever scraps he had left from the previous day, some leftover chicken and rice, and set them in a bowl, placing it on the floor next to Ranger. The dog's ears perked up at the scent of food, but he still didn't move at first. There was a wariness in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that this moment was real. Jake crouched down beside him, his voice soft and calm. "Go ahead, buddy. It's for you," Jake said, offering the dog a reassuring smile. "You've earned it." Ranger didn't hesitate this time. His instincts kicked in, and with a low grunt, he slowly stood up and moved toward the bowl. His movements were slow, almost cautious, but as soon as he began eating, his pace quickened. There was a hunger there, not just physical but emotional, a hunger for safety, for care, for kindness that had been absent for far too long. As the dog devoured the food, Jake stepped back, giving him space. He could see the relief in Ranger's body language, the way his shoulders relaxed and his posture softened. The tension that had been so visible earlier began to melt away. Jake watched quietly from the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he took a sip of water. It wasn't just the food that was healing Ranger, it was the simple act of being seen, of being cared for, that made the most difference. For Jake, it was a reminder of what it meant to truly live in the moment. In the midst of his own struggles with reintegrating into civilian life, he found solace in helping this dog, this animal who had been abandoned just like he had, in a way, by the world he used to know. After a while, Jake grabbed a towel from the bathroom and returned to Ranger, gently wiping the dust and dirt from the dog's coat. Ranger flinched at first, still unused to the touch of another person after being on his own for so long. But gradually, he relaxed into it, letting Jake clean him up. It was a simple task, but one that felt profound. There was something therapeutic about the rhythm of it, about restoring dignity to something that had been left in the dirt. Jake didn't speak much during this time. His actions spoke for him. His way of caring for Ranger, in small but meaningful ways, helped him process his own emotions, feelings he had never really allowed himself to confront after his time in the service. Once Ranger had eaten and was cleaned up, Jake took a step back, his hands on his hips as he surveyed the dog. Ranger's coat wasn't as glossy as it once had been, and there were visible signs of wear, scars, bruises, and signs of neglect. But despite everything, there was still a light in his eyes, a spark of life that hadn't been extinguished. It reminded Jake of the kind of resilience he admired in the people he had served with, people who, no matter how beaten down they were, always found a way to get back up. "I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what you've been through," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "But I know one thing, no one deserves to be left behind like that. No one." Ranger, for his part, simply lay there, watching Jake with an intensity that was hard to ignore. The dog's eyes spoke volumes. There was an unspoken gratitude in them, a silent acknowledgement of Jake's kindness. It was a bond, small but significant, forming between them. Jake knew that this wasn't a long-term solution. He couldn't keep the dog here forever, and Ranger needed more than just food and a clean space. He needed a permanent home, a place where he could feel secure. But for tonight, this was enough. It was the first time in a long while that Jake felt like he was doing something that mattered, something meaningful. He stood up, heading for the door to the bathroom, but not before glancing back at Ranger. "You're safe here for now," Jake said quietly. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next step." The dog lifted his head slightly, watching Jake with an almost knowing look in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, Ranger felt like he wasn't alone. He had someone watching over him. And for Jake, it was a moment of peace in the chaos of his own life, a small, unexpected step toward healing for both of them. The next few days passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. Jake's routine remained much the same, but now there was an added presence in his apartment, Ranger. The dog had settled into his new environment with surprising ease, though there was still a wariness about him. He didn't immediately trust everything, especially when it came to the noises of the city outside. Every passing car or person walking by the window would cause Ranger to stiffen, his ears twitching and his gaze fixated on the street below. It was clear that his time on the streets had left scars that went deeper than just physical ones. Jake, for his part, respected Ranger's space, giving him time to adjust at his own pace. He didn't force the dog to engage or play, though he always made sure to offer food, water, and affection when the moment seemed right. Slowly, the bond between them deepened, built on a foundation of mutual understanding. But Jake knew that Ranger's trauma went beyond the hunger and fear of the streets. The dog had been abandoned by the one person who should have protected him, his owner, the man who had once been his companion. It wasn't until a week later, when Jake was out for his daily walk, that he began to piece together more of Ranger's story. He had decided to take the dog to a nearby park, hoping to give him a change of scenery and maybe a bit of exercise. Jake had kept Ranger on a leash during their walks, though the dog was relatively well behaved. As they strolled along the path, Jake noticed people turning their heads and staring at the German Shepherd, many of them smiling at the dog's beauty, others commenting on how well-behaved he was. But it wasn't until a couple of women approached that things took an unexpected turn. "Oh my God, is that Ranger?" one of the women exclaimed, her voice filled with surprise and a tinge of disbelief. Jake stopped in his tracks, taken aback by the recognition. "You know him?" he asked, his tone cautious yet curious. The woman nodded enthusiastically, her eyes never leaving the dog. "I used to work for Mr. Holden, Margaret's husband. I remember Ranger. He was always so loyal, so well-trained. I thought he had died with her." Her voice trailed off, sadness flooding her expression. Jake could feel the tension in the air, as if the dog himself had somehow become a piece of a puzzle that had been broken for a long time. The other woman, standing beside her, added softly, "We didn't know what happened to Ranger after Mrs. Holden passed. I know he was there with her during her last days. Mr. Holden was always, well, he wasn't the most loving toward Ranger, but we never imagined he'd just let him go." Jake's stomach turned as the pieces of the story began to fall into place. This wasn't just any dog. This was Margaret's dog, the loyal companion who had been by her side through her illness, providing her with comfort and unwavering affection in her final days. The thought of the millionaire's cold decision to cast Ranger out, to treat him as expendable, filled Jake with an undeniable sense of anger. How could anyone treat an animal, a creature capable of such loyalty and devotion, with such callousness? The woman continued, her voice quieting as she spoke. "We all thought that after Margaret's passing, Mr. Holden would keep Ranger. He was the only family Margaret had left, but he couldn't even be bothered to care for the dog. It broke my heart. I loved that dog. He was the sweetest thing." Jake glanced down at Ranger, who had been standing still during the conversation, his ears back and his gaze distant. The dog seemed to recognize the familiarity of the women's voices, but there was no excitement, no joy, just a quiet sadness. Jake's heart ached for him. This was a dog who had given everything to the woman who loved him, only to be thrown aside when she was gone. After a long pause, Jake spoke, his voice low but filled with a quiet conviction. "He's safe now, he's with me." The woman nodded, though she seemed to sense that there was more to the story. "I'm glad he's found someone who cares about him," she said softly, her eyes lingering on the dog before she added, "But Mr. Holden, he won't be happy about this. He's not the type to just let someone take what's his." Jake felt a chill at the mention of the millionaire's name. He hadn't thought much about the man who had abandoned Ranger, but now he realized the depth of what had happened. The millionaire had treated his wife's death as a business transaction, something to be closed and moved on from, and in doing so, he had left a trail of brokenness behind him. And Ranger, the dog who had been there through it all, had paid the price. "Thanks for the information," Jake said, nodding at the women. They gave him a final sympathetic smile, and with that, they parted ways, leaving Jake and Ranger standing in the middle of the park. Jake watched the dog closely, his heart heavy. He didn't know what kind of man Margaret's husband had been, but it was clear that the millionaire had never understood the kind of love Ranger had to offer. It wasn't about ownership or control. It was about loyalty, trust, and a bond that couldn't be broken. And Jake was starting to realize something about himself as well. Taking care of Ranger wasn't just about helping a dog who had been abandoned. It was about reclaiming something for himself, something he'd lost during his years of service. Purpose, connection, the need to protect and nurture something that couldn't defend itself. As Jake stood there, watching Ranger stand beside him, he made a silent vow. He wasn't going to let this dog go through the same kind of abandonment again. No one, man or animal, deserved to feel like they were disposable. In the days that followed, Jake's bond with Ranger only grew stronger. The dog seemed to settle into a routine, one that was more predictable and filled with kindness than anything he had known in recent months. Jake made sure to take him on long walks, letting him explore the park and surrounding areas, where the dog could stretch his legs and enjoy the freedom he had been denied for so long. Ranger, though still somewhat reserved, began to show signs of trust. His tail would wag when Jake spoke to him, and he even seemed to enjoy the little games Jake would play, tossing a tennis ball and watching Ranger chase it with enthusiasm. These small moments were a balm for both of them. For Ranger, it was a return to the joys of companionship. For Jake, it was a reminder of what it felt like to care for something outside of himself, to protect someone who depended on him, the kind of purpose he had missed since leaving the Navy SEALs. But just as their lives began to settle into this new rhythm, the shadow of Margaret's husband, the millionaire, loomed over them. Jake had heard whispers from the women in the park about the man's character, but now he was starting to see the real danger that came with crossing him. It wasn't just a matter of a pet being taken away. It was about ownership, power, and control. The millionaire had treated Ranger like an expendable object, something to be discarded when it no longer suited his needs. Jake knew the man wasn't going to let go of the dog so easily. It was a Thursday afternoon when the call came. Jake had just returned from his daily run with Ranger when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, seeing an unfamiliar number with a local area code. His instincts told him to answer, but he hesitated for a moment. As much as he had been hopping for peace and privacy, he knew that things couldn't stay quiet forever. With a sigh, he swiped to answer. "Jake Carter," he said, trying to sound casual, though he already had a sinking feeling in his gut. The voice on the other end was smooth, cold, and unmistakably wealthy. "Mr. Carter, I trust I'm speaking with the man who has my dog." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. There was no mistaking who was calling. The voice belonged to none other than William Holden, the millionaire who had abandoned Ranger on the streets without a second thought. "Your dog," Jake echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "Ranger's not your dog anymore, he's with me now." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low chuckle that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "I see. I was hoping we could avoid a situation, Mr. Carter, but it seems you're more stubborn than I anticipated. You see, Ranger is a very valuable asset, and I intend to reclaim what's mine." Jake's jaw clenched. He had expected some kind of confrontation, but he hadn't anticipated just how brazen the millionaire would be. "Valuable asset?" Jake scoffed. "Ranger's not a piece of property, Holden. He's a living being, and I'm not giving him up to someone who treats him like trash." The words were out before Jake could stop them, and for a moment, there was a tense silence on the other end of the line. Jake's pulse quickened, the weight of the conversation sinking in. He could feel the air grow thick with a sense of foreboding. There was something about Holden's tone, something menacing, that made it clear this wasn't a simple disagreement. It was the start of something much bigger. "Mr. Carter," Holden's voice was smoother now, as if he were enjoying the conversation. "I understand you've grown attached to the dog. But let's be clear, I will be taking him back, one way or another. I suggest you hand him over before things get complicated. You don't want to make an enemy of me." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure whether the millionaire was simply playing mind games or if he was truly capable of making things difficult, but he knew one thing for sure: Holden wasn't the type of person to back down easily. His words carried the weight of someone used to getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. "Complicated," Jake repeated, his voice low but steady. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Holden. I'm not giving Ranger back, and you can't intimidate me into doing it. He's not your property anymore." Holden's response was dangerously calm, his tone becoming colder, more calculated. "Very well, Mr. Carter, I'll give you a week. If you haven't returned him by then, I will be forced to take further action. And trust me, you don't want that." The line went dead, the sound of the click echoing in Jake's ear. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand, as if waiting for the call to come back, to say it was all a joke. But it didn't. The millionaire had made his intentions clear. He wanted Ranger back, and he wasn't going to let go without a fight. Jake felt his muscles tighten as the weight of the situation settled over him. He'd known that keeping Ranger would come with consequences, but hearing it directly from Holden made the threat feel all too real. The man wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was ruthless. Jake had no doubt that if he didn't back down, the millionaire would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. As Jake walked into the living room, he found Ranger lying on the couch, his head resting on his paws. The dog looked up as Jake approached, his eyes filled with trust, and for a moment, Jake's resolve wavered. He had promised to protect this dog, and he wasn't about to let some rich, arrogant man take that promise away. "Don't worry, buddy," Jake murmured, sitting beside Ranger and gently stroking his fur. "I'm not giving up on you. We'll get through this together." Jake's determination hardened. He wasn't just protecting a dog, he was protecting a life that had been discarded, a life that deserved a chance. The millionaire may have money and power on his side, but Jake had something far more important, a reason to fight. And he would fight, no matter the cost, to keep Ranger safe. Jake spent the rest of the day stewing over the phone call. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He knew William Holden wasn't the type to back down easily, and the billionaire's words rang in Jake's ears, cold and calculated. "I will be forced to take further action," Holden had said. The vague threat felt like a shadow hanging over him, one that he couldn't ignore. But Jake wasn't a man to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. The next morning, as the sun rose, Jake's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't just facing a battle to keep Ranger safe. He was standing up against a man who thought his wealth and power gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. That kind of arrogance couldn't go unchallenged. If Holden thought he could intimidate Jake into handing over Ranger, he was sorely mistaken. The dog had been abandoned by Holden when he needed him most, and now, after everything Ranger had been through, Jake wasn't going to let the millionaire just waltz back in and take him. Jake didn't know exactly what Holden was capable of, but he wasn't about to let the millionaire have free rein over his life or Ranger. He had to be prepared, not just mentally, but physically. If Holden was serious about reclaiming the dog, Jake needed to make sure he had a plan, a backup plan. He couldn't afford to take any chances. After a quick breakfast, Jake headed out for his usual run with Ranger, but this time things felt different. As they jogged through the park, Jake kept an eye out for any signs that Holden's influence might be closer than he realized. He had been careful to keep Ranger's whereabouts as private as possible, but the billionaire had connections, and Jake knew it wouldn't take much for someone to find out where he lived. If Holden was going to come after him, he needed to be ready for anything. Later that afternoon, Jake decided to take a trip to the local animal shelter. He wanted to make sure that Ranger's microchip information was updated and properly registered in his name, just in case Holden tried to claim ownership through legal channels. He also wanted to get in touch with a lawyer, someone who could advise him on how best to handle the situation. Jake didn't have much experience with the law when it came to animal custody, but he knew that Holden, with all his money and resources, would likely go that route if push came to shove. At the shelter, Jake met with the director, a woman named Lisa, who was more than willing to help him. She had heard about Ranger's situation and offered to provide any documentation he needed to ensure that the dog's adoption was legitimate. After a brief conversation, Lisa made it clear that the shelter was fully behind Jake. They weren't going to let Holden take the dog without a fight either. "I'll get the paperwork for you right away," Lisa said. "If Holden tries to claim Ranger, he'll have to go through us. I'm sure he's got a lot of money to throw around, but that doesn't mean he's going to win this. We've got your back." Jake was grateful for her support, but he knew that the situation was only going to get more complicated as time passed. He couldn't just rely on paperwork and legal advice. He needed to make sure that Ranger was safe from any threats, physical or otherwise. That evening, as Jake and Ranger returned from another walk, Jake's instincts told him that something was off. The streets seemed quieter than usual, and the air felt heavier, as if a storm was brewing. When they reached the apartment, Jake noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside, but the vehicle was clearly out of place. Jake's heart rate quickened, and his mind raced. Was this Holden's doing? Had the millionaire sent someone to keep tabs on him? It wasn't a stretch to think that Holden could afford to hire people to follow him, especially if he was determined to reclaim the dog. Jake took a deep breath and made a mental note to stay alert. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he wasn't about to ignore the possibility that Holden was already making good on his threats. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. The phone call, the cold, dismissive tone of Holden's voice, the way the millionaire had used his wealth and privilege to try to intimidate him. But Jake wasn't someone who could be intimidated. Not anymore. He had learned that lesson long ago in the military. He wasn't afraid of challenges, he thrived on them. And this challenge, protecting Ranger, felt more personal than anything he'd ever faced before. He thought about the dog lying on the couch, his body curled up in peaceful sleep. Ranger was finally safe, finally cared for, but Jake knew that wouldn't last if Holden had his way. The billionaire had a plan, and Jake had no illusions that it would be easy to thwart. But Jake wasn't backing down, not from a fight he knew was right, not from a fight for something that mattered. The next morning, Jake woke up with a singular focus. He needed to prepare for whatever Holden would throw his way. He couldn't take chances, and he couldn't wait around for Holden to make his move. Whether it was legal action, intimidation, or something more physical, Jake had to be ready. He would protect Ranger at all costs. He wasn't just defending a dog, he was standing up for what was right. The days that followed were tense, filled with an underlying sense of anticipation. Jake knew that the clock was ticking. Holden's deadline was fast approaching, and Jake couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had done everything he could to prepare. The paperwork from the animal shelter had been finalized, and his legal advisor had assured him that his case was solid if it came to a dispute. But even with all the legal protections in place, Jake understood that a man like Holden wouldn't hesitate to go beyond the law if it suited him. This wasn't just about Ranger anymore. It was about power, who had it, who could wield it, and who would stand in their way. Jake's days were now spent in a constant state of vigilance. Every time he left the apartment, his eyes scanned the streets for any sign of Holden's hired muscle or any other strange activity. He'd parked his car in the garage under the building, just in case Holden sent someone to follow him. He kept Ranger with him as much as possible, whether that meant taking him on longer walks through the park or spending time on the couch watching TV, always with the dog close by his side. Jake had become almost paranoid, hyper-aware of every little detail. If someone was watching, Jake wanted to make sure they knew that Ranger was under his protection and that no one was going to take him without a fight. But even in the midst of all this tension, there was a strange sense of calm between Jake and Ranger. The dog, for his part, had seemed to settle into his new life. He still carried with him the emotional scars of his past, but his trust in Jake had only deepened. He followed Jake everywhere, whether it was to the grocery store or on one of their walks, and seemed to relax in the comfort of routine. In some ways, Ranger had become Jake's anchor, a constant reminder of the importance of loyalty, companionship, and protection. It was hard for Jake not to feel a sense of gratitude toward the dog. Ranger was the one thing in his life that had given him a sense of purpose again, and that was a gift Jake didn't take lightly. But even as their bond deepened, Jake knew the real battle was still ahead. Holden wasn't the kind of man to let go of something he believed was his. And though Jake had his own ways of defending what was his, ways learned from years of training and experience, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation would be different. This wasn't just a fight over a dog. It was a fight against a man who believed he could do whatever he wanted, a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable. That feeling only intensified when Jake got an unexpected visitor one evening. It was just after dark when a knock came at the door. Jake had been sitting on the couch, watching the news, when the sound echoed through the apartment. His hand immediately went to the gun holstered at his waist. He had started carrying it after the phone call with Holden, not because he thought things would escalate to violence, but because he wasn't going to let his guard down. He walked to the door slowly, peeking through the peephole to see who was standing outside. When he saw the man standing on the other side, his heart sank. It was one of Holden's private security personnel, a large, imposing man dressed in dark clothes, his face expressionless. Jake had no doubt that this was the first of many visits from Holden's people, meant to intimidate him into backing down. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself before opening the door. He wasn't about to let anyone push him around. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice firm but calm. The security guard glanced down at the dog beside Jake, his eyes narrowing. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Holden," the man said, his tone flat. "You're to return Ranger to him. He's not your dog, and if you don't comply, we'll be forced to take further action." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had expected this, an intimidation tactic, an attempt to make him feel small, to pressure him into handing over Ranger, but Jake had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down. "I don't think you understand," Jake replied, his voice steady. "Ranger isn't going anywhere. He's been through enough, and I'm not giving him up to anyone. Not to Holden, not to anyone. So you can go back to your boss and tell him that." The security guard stepped forward slightly, his size imposing. Jake could see the man's muscles tense, as if he was preparing to make a move, but Jake wasn't intimidated. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but alert. His hand never left the grip of the gun under his jacket. He wasn't about to escalate the situation, but he wouldn't let anyone threaten him or Ranger. "I suggest you reconsider," the man growled. "Holden has ways of making people regret defying him. This isn't something you want to turn into a bigger issue than it already is." Jake's heart raced, but his mind remained clear. He had already made the decision. He wasn't going to let this bully or Holden's money dictate what happened to Ranger. The dog had suffered enough, and Jake wasn't about to let him be tossed aside again. "You can tell Holden whatever you want," Jake said, his voice even, "but this ends here. I'm not giving Ranger up. Not now, not ever." The security guard glared at Jake for a long moment, as if sizing him up, considering his next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man stepped back, his expression hardening. "You'll regret this," he muttered before turning and walking away, his boots thudding against the floor as he left. Jake stood at the door for a few seconds, his mind still racing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't over, it had only just begun, but one thing was clear: Holden wouldn't get Ranger without a fight, and Jake was more than ready for it. He closed the door and turned to look at Ranger, who had been quietly sitting on the couch, watching the exchange. Jake knelt down to the dog, giving him a gentle pat on the head. "It's just you and me now, buddy," Jake said softly, "and we're not backing down." The following days were fraught with an unsettling quiet. After the security guard's visit, Jake had expected Holden to retaliate, but he hadn't anticipated the level of aggression that would come next. It started with a subtle shift, a feeling that someone was always watching. Jake would catch glimpses of cars slowing as they passed by his apartment building, and sometimes he could swear he saw shadows lingering just beyond his window. The streets, once familiar and safe, had taken on an eerie quality, and Jake was certain that Holden had set his sights on more than just intimidation. The millionaire wasn't just trying to scare him off, he was trying to wear him down. It was the evening of the 5th day since the security guard's visit when things finally came to a head. Jake had just finished taking Ranger for their usual walk through the park when he saw the black SUV parked in the same spot across the street. This time, however, the vehicle wasn't alone. There were 2 more cars in tow, all parked at strategic angles, their engines running softly in the dim light of dusk. Jake's stomach tightened, and an uncomfortable sense of urgency gripped him. He turned to look at Ranger, who was walking a few paces ahead, his head low and ears back, clearly uneasy. The dog's behavior confirmed Jake's suspicion. This wasn't just a coincidence. Holden's people were closing in. Jake's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a game of legal wrangling or intimidation anymore. The millionaire had sent his people to scout him out, perhaps to intimidate him further or even to force him into a corner. Jake wasn't about to wait around and find out. He had to act. First, he turned to the dog. "Stay close, buddy," he muttered under his breath, moving to tighten his grip on the leash. There was no time to waste. They needed to get back to the apartment and fast, Jake could feel his pulse quicken as he made the decision. He wasn't going to wait until things escalated further. Holden wasn't the type to simply back off after a couple of failed attempts. He would only get more brazen the longer Jake stayed passive. They reached the apartment building in record time. As Jake moved to unlock the door, his eyes darted to the parked SUV once more. It was almost like the vehicle was watching him, its tinted windows obscuring the faces of whoever might be inside. For a brief moment, Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure what Holden's next move was going to be, but he knew that the threat was growing with every passing minute. Inside the apartment, Jake locked the door behind him and immediately began to assess his options. Ranger trotted over to his bed in the corner, settling down with a sigh, but Jake was far from calm. His mind was racing as he paced the room. He knew Holden had the resources to make things difficult for him, financially, legally, and now, it seemed, physically. The last thing Jake wanted was to get into a confrontation that might put Ranger in danger. But at this point, it was clear that Holden was prepared to escalate things in ways that Jake couldn't ignore. His first thought was to leave the city, to take Ranger somewhere far from Holden's reach. But Jake knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only delay the inevitable. Holden had too many connections, and Jake couldn't keep running. No, he had to stand his ground, right here, in his own home. He wasn't going to let a man with power think that he could trample over him, not when he had the right to defend what was his. Jake made a call to Lisa at the animal shelter, asking her to prepare the necessary documents once again. This time, however, he needed something more than just legal backing. He needed the shelter to help him make Ranger's adoption as public as possible, to get the word out that the dog wasn't just a lost pet. He was part of a larger effort to fight for the rights of animals who had been abandoned or mistreated by their owners. Lisa agreed, her voice tinged with worry, but also determination. "We've got your back, Jake. If Holden wants to make this an issue, we'll take it to the media. We won't back down either." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Public pressure could work in his favor, especially if he had the community's support. The more people who knew the story, the harder it would be for Holden to reclaim Ranger. It was time to stop being the quiet man in the shadows. Jake had to go on the offensive. Jake then placed a call to his old military contacts. He wasn't sure how far things would go, but he knew that if Holden was really willing to take things this far, he might need backup, real backup. As he spoke to a few trusted friends from his time in the SEALs, Jake explained the situation, leaving out nothing. He needed resources, he needed information, and he needed people who could be counted on when things got ugly. One of his old buddies, Ryan, promised to help. "I can't promise anything, Jake, but if this guy's pulling strings, we'll find out how far he's willing to go. We've got your back." Jake hung up the phone and felt the weight of what he was about to do settle in. This was no longer just a fight for a dog. It was a stand against a man who had used his wealth and power to trample on the rights of others. Holden had underestimated Jake, and that was a mistake he wasn't going to make twice. As Jake turned to Ranger, who had been silently watching him through the whole conversation, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The dog had trusted him, and Jake wasn't about to let him down. Whatever Holden was planning, Jake would meet it head-on. "We're not backing down, buddy," Jake said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We're in this together." The storm that was building on the horizon wasn't something Jake could avoid any longer, but he had made up his mind. He was going to fight, and he would fight hard. No one, not Holden, not anyone, was going to take Ranger from him. Not now, not ever. Jake had always known that things were going to get ugly, but he had never expected it to escalate this quickly. The past few days had been a whirlwind of preparation, and as the tension in the air thickened, Jake could feel the storm approaching. Holden wasn't going to give up on getting Ranger back without a fight, and Jake was ready to meet him head-on. The phone calls from his old military contacts had been the first real sense of relief. Ryan, his friend from the SEALs, had been instrumental in gathering information on Holden's movements. It turned out that Holden's wealth wasn't just about business, it was about influence. He had connections in places Jake had never even considered. People in law enforcement, private security firms, and even a few legal loopholes that made it harder for Jake to secure Ranger's future without a direct confrontation. It was clear that Holden wasn't just a businessman. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, no matter the cost. Jake spent the next few days planning for the worst-case scenario. He wasn't sure how Holden would make his move, but Jake knew that the millionaire would strike when he least expected it. Every time Jake stepped outside, every time he took Ranger out for a walk, he kept his eyes peeled for anything suspicious. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. The calls and emails with the animal shelter were becoming more frequent as well. Lisa had been working behind the scenes to get the story out to the public, and although the media hadn't picked up on it yet, there was growing support within the animal rights community. People were beginning to rally behind the cause, advocating for the rights of animals who had been discarded by their owners. That was Jake's silver lining. The more people who knew about Ranger's plight, the harder it would be for Holden to walk in and take the dog without facing public backlash. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in a battle against someone like Holden, even small victories counted. Still, Jake knew this wasn't just about public opinion. When it came down to it, he had to be ready for anything. He knew Holden wasn't going to go through the courts. No, that would take too long. Holden wasn't a man who played by the rules if he didn't have to. If Jake was going to protect Ranger, he had to be prepared for a more direct attack. The thought of it made Jake uneasy, but he couldn't afford to be passive. The stakes were too high. One night, as Jake was getting ready for bed, a sudden knock on the door startled him. His heart rate spiked. It was just past midnight. Who could it be at this hour? He slowly approached the door, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun he kept close by. Peeking through the peephole, he saw no one. His pulse quickened. Whoever had knocked was playing a game, trying to make him nervous. He opened the door carefully, scanning the hallway. There was nothing, but as he stepped outside, something caught his eye. On the ground, just a few steps from the door, was a letter. The envelope was thick and expensive-looking, and the handwriting on it was neat but unfamiliar. Jake's stomach sank as he bent down to pick it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words written on it were simple but chilling. "I warned you, Jake. Time's running out. Bring Ranger to the address below. If you don't, there will be consequences. W.H." Jake's fingers trembled as he read the note a second time, his mind racing. It was Holden. The man wasn't playing around anymore. This wasn't just about taking Ranger back. This was about sending a message. Jake could almost hear the icy coldness of Holden's voice in the words. The billionaire was ready to escalate, and Jake had no doubt that the consequences Holden threatened were not idle threats. The address at the bottom of the page wasn't far. It was an old warehouse, one that Jake had passed a few times on his runs. He didn't know much about the place, but it had an unsettling feel to it. It was isolated, far from the main roads, and there were few buildings nearby, perfect for someone who wanted to operate under the radar. Jake knew what he had to do. There was no backing down now. He wasn't about to let Holden take Ranger in the dead of night like some kind of thief. He'd promised Ranger he would protect him, and he wasn't about to break that promise. But the situation was starting to feel like a trap. Jake wasn't foolish enough to walk into a situation unprepared. He grabbed his phone and dialed Lisa's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Jake, what's going on?" Her voice sounded concerned, and Jake quickly explained the situation. The letter, the address, everything. "Get the media involved," Jake said urgently. "I don't know if this is a setup, but if it is, I need people to know where I'm going. It's a warehouse off of Bellevue Road. Send someone to check it out. I need backup." Lisa didn't hesitate. "You've got it, Jake. We'll have someone there." After hanging up, Jake glanced at Ranger, who was quietly watching him from the couch. The dog seemed to sense that something was off. Jake went to him and knelt down, looking him in the eye. "We're doing this, buddy," Jake said softly. "You stay close to me. Whatever happens, we stick together." With that, Jake grabbed his jacket, put the gun in his holster, and headed out the door, Ranger by his side. It was time to end this once and for all. He wouldn't let Holden win, not over Ranger, not over what was right to be shuffled around. "He's a living creature, and he's mine now," Jake said, his voice firm and unwavering. Holden's eyes darkened, his smile fading. "I warned you, Jake, I really did, but you're making this so much harder than it needs to be." His eyes flicked toward two men standing near the shadows who had remained silent until now. They were large, muscular, and clearly there for intimidation. Jake knew the moment he saw them that this wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about power, control, and Holden's unwillingness to lose face. "I've made my decision, Holden," Jake said, his voice a low growl. "You can't just take him, not now, not after everything." Holden's gaze shifted to the men beside him. One of them stepped forward, his hand on the gun holstered at his side. But before he could make a move, Jake's hand was already on his own weapon. His training, his reflexes, everything he had learned in the SEALs kicked in. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that it caught everyone off guard. "I'm not here to fight, but I will if it comes to that," Jake warned, his tone dark. "You can leave now, or we can do this the hard way, your choice." The tension in the warehouse thickened. The two men froze, weighing their options, and Holden's expression shifted from smug confidence to something far more calculating. Jake wasn't sure if Holden would back down, but he wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes. He had come here with one goal, to protect Ranger, no matter what it took. Holden glanced briefly at the men beside him, and for a split second, Jake thought the situation might escalate further. But then, something unexpected happened. Holden's shoulders slumped slightly, and he raised his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with annoyance but tempered with an air of finality. "You want to keep the dog, fine, but understand this. This isn't over, Jake, not by a long shot." Jake did lower his guard. "You've lost, Holden. You'll never get him back." The millionaire's eyes flashed with rage for a moment, but he didn't make a move. Instead, he nodded to his men. "Get out of here," he muttered, his voice tight. "We are done here." Jake stayed still, watching as Holden's men reluctantly retreated into the shadows. The air hung heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. For a moment, it felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. But then, as Holden's figure retreated into the darkness, Jake allowed himself to exhale slowly. "Come on, buddy," Jake said to Ranger, who had been silently watching the exchange. "Let's get out of here." As they walked back toward the door, Jake couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. It wasn't over, not yet. But tonight they had won. For now at least, Ranger was safe. And Jake had shown Holden that no amount of money or power could force him to back down. He had made his stand, and he had won. As Jake and Ranger made their way back to the apartment, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The adrenaline from the standoff still buzzed in his veins, but the overwhelming sense of relief was what truly dominated his thoughts. They had done it. They had faced down a powerful man who thought his money could buy anything, and they had come out on top. For now, at least, Ranger was safe. As they walked through the front door of the apartment, Jake felt a calmness he hadn't experienced in days. Ranger trotted over to his bed, collapsing with a contented sigh, and Jake couldn't help but smile. The dog had been through so much, and yet somehow he had remained by Jake's side through it all. There was something deeply humbling about that kind of loyalty, something that Jake didn't take for granted. He sat down on the couch, his mind replaying the confrontation at the warehouse. It was hard to believe it was over. But deep down, Jake knew it wasn't truly finished. Holden might have backed down, but that man would never forget how close he had come to losing everything. Jake wasn't naive enough to think Holden wouldn't try again, maybe in a different way or through other means. But tonight had shown Jake something important. When it comes to protecting what matters, there's no limit to what you'll do. Jake had made a choice. He had decided to fight for Ranger, and he wasn't going to stop until that fight was over. But it wasn't just about protecting a dog, it was about standing up against injustice. It was about showing that no amount of money or power could take away the things that matter most. Jake knew that this experience had changed him. He'd always thought of himself as a protector, but now he understood just how far that responsibility could go. Sometimes it meant putting everything on the line. It meant fighting not just for what's right, but for the creatures who can't fight for themselves. Jake looked over at Ranger, who was now fast asleep on his bed, breathing softly, undisturbed by the chaos that had nearly consumed them both. The dog had finally found peace, and Jake couldn't be more grateful. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Holden was still out there, still a threat. But Jake had made it through this battle, and he was ready for whatever came next. As he sat there in the quiet of the apartment, Jake couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. What had started as a simple fight for one dog's safety had become something more. It had shown Jake just how much he was willing to risk for what was right, and it had made him realize that sometimes standing up for someone else, whether it's a dog, a loved one, or even a stranger, was the most important thing you could do. Jake's journey wasn't over, and while this chapter might have closed with a victory, he knew there would always be challenges ahead. But that was part of life, wasn't it? Standing up, no matter how hard things got, no matter how powerful the opposition. That was the lesson Jake had learned, and one he was never going to forget. So what do you think? Can you relate to Jake's fight to protect what's important, no matter the cost? It's a story that resonates with all of us. Whether you're standing up for a loved one, a pet, or even for yourself, sometimes the most important thing you can do is hold your ground and never back down. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Swift Tale for more incredible stories like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think about Jake's journey. How would you have handled a situation like this? Let's get a conversation going. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the toughest battles are the ones worth fighting for. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right.